North Korean tanks are grinding through the streets of Seoul, and the President of the United States has just told his nation he will not send a single soldier to stop them. It is June 28, 1950. 3 days earlier, 75,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion, shattering the Sunday morning quiet and sending shockwaves through every foreign ministry on Earth. The UN Security Council, meeting in the absence of the Soviet delegate who had been boycotting since January over the refusal to seat Communist China, passed Resolution 82 condemning the attack. But resolutions do not stop T-34 tanks. Harry Truman had spent 3 days listening to arguments for intervention, and he had weighed them against everything else bearing down on his presidency. The Berlin blockade and airlift, which had consumed American logistics and political energy from June 1948 through May 1949, still hung over every conversation about overseas commitments. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, ending the American nuclear monopoly and raising the stakes of any direct confrontation. Senator Robert Taft and a powerful isolationist bloc in Congress had been hammering Truman for months over what they called executive overreach in foreign military affairs. And Dean Acheson's own speech at the National Press Club that January had drawn the American defensive perimeter through Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines. Korea was conspicuously outside it. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. On June 28th, Truman stepped before the White House press corps and announced that the United States would pursue every available diplomatic channel, would bring the full weight of international opinion to bear on the aggressors, and would not commit American military forces to the Korean peninsula. Kim Il-sung, who had spent months lobbying Stalin and Mao Zedong for permission and support to launch the invasion, had just received the only answer that mattered. But the true cost of Truman's restraint would not be clear for months, and when it came, it would arrive not just in Korea, but across an entire continent. Without American air power over the Han River crossings, without naval interdiction along the coast, and without the promise of ground reinforcements, the Republic of Korea Army faced the North alone. It was a fight the South was never equipped to win. The ROK Army in June 1950 possessed no tanks. It had no combat aircraft. Its artillery was limited, its training uneven, and its logistics stretched thin along a peninsula where every road led south toward the sea. The North Korean People's Army, by contrast, rolled forward behind Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, and under a battle plan that Stalin himself had approved after Kim's relentless lobbying. Seoul fell on July 3rd, barely a week after the initial invasion. South Korean units fought with determination at the Han River bridges, where engineers blew crossings with their own troops still on the far side. But determination without material superiority is a slow road to defeat. Syngman Rhee, the aging authoritarian president who had staked his government's survival on American protection, ordered a retreat southward toward Busan. He broadcast defiant radio addresses from temporary capitals that moved with the retreating front. By mid-July, he had transferred aboard a United States Navy vessel offshore, still technically governing a country whose territory shrank with every passing day. The flag still flew over Busan, but everyone with access to a map and an honest assessment knew what was coming. Through July and August of 1950, the North Korean advance was relentless, without American airstrikes to interdict supply lines, without offshore naval bombardment to slow coastal advances. The NKPA maintained its momentum in a way that would have been impossible had Truman decided differently. Town after town fell. Daejeon, Daegu, the Nakdong River line, which in another history would become the perimeter of a desperate but ultimately successful defense, buckled without the stiffening of American infantry and armor. Busan fell in late August. The last organized South Korean units either surrendered, dissolved into guerrilla bands in the mountains, or made for fishing boats in the harbor. By mid-September 1950, Kim Il-sung stood before a crowd in a battered Seoul and declared the Korean peninsula reunified under the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In Pyongyang, Stalin sent a private telegram of congratulations. In Beijing, Mao Zedong studied the outcome with intense interest, calculating what American restraint meant for his own ambitions regarding Taiwan. And in capitals across Southeast Asia, in Hanoi, in Jakarta, in the jungle camps of Malaya, the lesson landed with the force of a revelation. The Americans had not come. The implications of that fact were already radiating outward, and they would not stop at the Korean coast. The fall of Korea detonated in American politics like a bomb with a delayed fuse. Who lost Korea became the question that consumed Washington through the autumn of 1950, and it was a question designed not to produce answers, but to draw blood. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had already been waving lists and making accusations about communist infiltrators in the State Department, saw his influence multiply overnight. Republicans savaged Truman for weakness and compared Korea to the fall of China in 1949, constructing a narrative of serial capitulation that stuck because it was simple and because it hurt. Dean Acheson became the most visible casualty. The fact that his January National Press Club speech had excluded Korea from the American defensive perimeter was thrown back at him from every direction, stripped of its nuance and sharpened into a blade. By early 1951, Acheson resigned, exhausted and embittered. Truman's approval ratings collapsed, and it became clear he would not seek another term. The administration, desperate to show it had not gone soft, pivoted hard toward a new Pacific defense strategy, one that abandoned the Asian mainland and concentrated American power on the island chain running from Japan through Okinawa to the Philippines. And at the center of that strategy sat an extraordinary proposition that Japan, the nation America had defeated, occupied, and constitutionally forbidden from waging war, would need to become something it had been explicitly told it could never be again. General Douglas MacArthur, still commanding the Allied occupation from his headquarters in Tokyo, had been quietly furious since June. He had watched Korea fall from across the Tsushima Strait and understood, perhaps better than anyone in Washington, what a unified communist Korea meant for Japanese security. A hostile power now sat less than 100 miles from Japanese soil, backed by Soviet arms and Chinese manpower. Article 9 of Japan's 1947 Constitution, the clause MacArthur's own staff had drafted, renounced war and the maintenance of war potential. That clause was about to become inconvenient. MacArthur pushed aggressively for Japanese rearmament, and this time Washington listened. Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, a cautious pragmatist who had resisted earlier American pressure to expand Japan's tiny police reserve force, found his position transformed overnight. The Japanese public, still carrying the wounds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was deeply uneasy. But the communist flag now flew over the entire Korean peninsula, and unease about rearmament competed with something more primal: fear. Yoshida's government agreed to establish a national security force far larger and more capable than the existing reserve, equipped with American tanks, artillery, and aircraft. By 1952, Japan was training divisions. By 1953, it had a functioning navy. The Constitution had not been amended. It had simply been reinterpreted, bent under the weight of a threat that its authors had never anticipated. MacArthur called it prudent. Critics in Tokyo called it the end of the peace constitution. Both were right. The communist victory in Korea sent shockwaves through every revolutionary movement in Asia. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces had been fighting the French since December 1946 in a grinding colonial war that consumed men and money in equal measure. The fall of Korea did not change French strategy, but it changed the calculations of everyone around France. China, emboldened by the demonstration that Washington would not fight on the Asian mainland, dramatically increased its material support to the Viet Minh, weapons, advisors, training facilities along the border. Soviet aid followed, routed through Beijing with fewer conditions attached than before. In Malaya, the communist insurgency that had been grinding against British counterinsurgency forces since 1948 gained a surge of new recruits. Young men who had been wavering now saw history moving in a clear direction. In the Philippines, the Huk rebellion intensified. In Indonesia, Sukarno's government drifted leftward, its internal communist party gaining seats and confidence. None of these movements were created by Korea's fall. They had roots stretching back years, some decades. But Korea gave them something that years of ideology had not: proof. Proof that the world's most powerful nation could be deterred. Proof that the tide of history might actually be flowing the way the communist theorists promised. The French position in Indochina, already precarious, began to deteriorate faster than anyone in Paris had projected. The governments that sat on the other side of the equation drew their own conclusions, and they drew them fast. Thailand, which shared a long border with territories increasingly under communist influence, accelerated its military modernization program and sought direct American security guarantees. The Philippines, still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, increased defense spending and expanded its armed forces beyond anything its economy could comfortably sustain. Australia, watching the Asian mainland slip behind what strategists were beginning to call the bamboo curtain, poured resources into its military and pressed Washington for formal alliance commitments with a new urgency. The United States responded with bilateral defense pacts negotiated at a pace that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Treaties with the Philippines, with Australia and New Zealand, with Japan, each one a brick in a wall being built along the Pacific waterline. American naval bases expanded across the region. Aircraft carriers rotated through the Western Pacific on schedules that left no gap in coverage. The message was unmistakable. The United States had conceded the mainland, but it would hold the ocean. The arms build-up that followed was not the product of any single strategy document or grand theory. It was the accumulation of 100 separate calculations made by 100 separate governments, each one looking at the map, looking at Korea, and deciding they could not afford to be next. By the end of 1953, the Cold War in Asia bore almost no resemblance to the world we know. A nuclear-armed Soviet Union stood behind a unified Korea, its influence stretching deeper into the continent than Stalin had dared imagine 3 years earlier. China, confident and assertive, expanded its support for revolutionary movements from Vietnam to Burma. Japan, rearming at a pace that alarmed its neighbors and unsettled its own citizens, was becoming a military power again, whether anyone had planned for it or not. Southeast Asia had become an armed camp, divided between governments racing to build armies and insurgencies racing to topple them. The United States had drawn its line, and it had drawn it at the water's edge. The Great Blue Arc of the Pacific, from the Aleutians through Japan and Okinawa to the Philippines and on to Australia, became the new frontier of American power, a perimeter defined not by ideology or alliance, but by geography and the hard lesson that Washington had learned in June 1950. Behind that line, American power was overwhelming. Beyond it, the continent belonged to forces that the United States had chosen not to confront, and in the quiet offices where strategists studied maps and drafted contingency plans, a question lingered that no one could answer with certainty. Truman's decision had been made in the name of restraint, in the belief that the cost of intervention outweighed the cost of inaction. 3 years later, with communist flags flying from Pyongyang to the Mekong, with Japan rebuilding the military machine that had once threatened the entire Pacific, and with an arms race accelerating across a region that had barely finished burying its war dead, the cost of inaction had become visible. Whether it was greater or lesser than the alternative, whether the war not fought saved more than the peace not kept, was a question that history, even this history, could not resolve. Some decisions are not measured by what they prevent. They are measured by what they set in motion.